Whenever you're ready.
I invite you to think about the time that you last felt completely safe, totally at home. Where was the place that you felt most safe? Maybe it was your parents' house, your grandparents', your best friend's house growing up. Think of the way that you walked in the door, kicked off your shoes, flopped into the couch with a sigh of contentment, went to the fridge and got food out without asking, let down your guard and were fully yourself. You're safe. You're at home. As I've been preparing to share with you the sermon for today, I have been reading Jeremiah 33, 14 through 16, which was the lectionary text this last Sunday. And I've been reflecting on this idea of safety and what does it mean to be at home, particularly in a world where so often we are terribly unsafe. Our world has a way of responding to this lack of safety. The world tells us to be afraid of ISIS, to be afraid of global warming, to be afraid of refugees, of sexual predators, of gun violence, of carcinogenic plastics, car accidents, on and on and on. And to speak a word of hope to a world that seems so hell-bent on fear seems absurd. But the scripture today invites us to reconsider what safety might mean in an unsafe world. Jeremiah 33, 14 through 16 says this: "The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill my gracious promise with the people of Israel and Judah. In those days and at that time, I will raise up a righteous branch from David's line, who will do what is just and right in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this is what he will be called: the Lord is our righteousness." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
As the prophet Jeremiah is writing these words, he is not home. He's actually in prison. The king Zedekiah locked him up in the palace courtyard because he had been committing an act of sedition. Jeremiah wasn't exactly in the favor of Zedekiah because Zedekiah had double-crossed the Babylonians with whom the Israelites were aligned. So he had actually called the Egyptians in to help wage war against the Babylonians. The Babylonians found out, and they were actually coming to siege Jerusalem. Jeremiah had predicted that this would happen, that the Babylonians would in fact come and take over, and Zedekiah would not be spared. Needless to say, Zedekiah wasn't very happy to hear this, and so he locked Jeremiah up in the palace with guards all around. And so as we read this passage, the Babylonian army is outside the city gates, besieging Jerusalem, and the city is about to be completely destroyed. Now, for so long, Jeremiah has been the voice of judgment against the people of Israel and Judah. He's been called on again and again by the Lord to tell the people to quit their habits of idolatry. And he's been the sole voice who has been criticizing the leaders for abandoning their commitment to the living God. The kings have enhanced their power through manipulation, through violence, through extraction from the most marginal members of society. Jeremiah has persistently reminded the leaders that if they don't change their ways, the consequences are going to be tragic. And now, at this point, Jeremiah's prophecy is beginning to be realized. The people of Judah have been living underneath enemy rule for a long time, and now they're being actively attacked. Now, if you've ever been to the city of Jerusalem, there's only a few entrances, and that's great for protection until you're under siege. And when your food supplies run out, you're in trouble. And so the people are being starved out of Jerusalem. Soon they will become exiles, taken into captivity by the Babylonians. And I can imagine Jeremiah looking around at the four walls of his prison, despairing. And I imagine him asking himself, is this it? Is it too late for things to turn around? Has God given up on us? I picture him listening to the Babylonian soldiers outside the city walls as they say to each other, Just one day more. That'll be enough to start them out. Then Jerusalem will be ours. And I think of the prophet's heart aching as he hears the cries of babies calling out for their mother's milk that has long since dried up. Maybe he asks himself, will this generation be stripped of the opportunity to live a free life? Will they ever run and dance and worship the living God? Or will they be forced, under Babylonian rule, to worship false gods? The situation is desperate. The city of God's promise has become a place of horror and suffering. There's no way out of the besieged city except to enter into captivity. The people of God are starving to death, and they are also starving for a word of hope from God. Now, that a word of hope would be spoken at this point in the story seems utterly absurd, does it not? But that's what God gives to Jeremiah. In the midst of desperate suffering, God speaks a word of hope in order to sustain God's people. In verse 14, Jeremiah shares the Lord's declaration. The time is coming when I will fulfill my gracious promise with the people of Israel and Judah. It's in the midst of imprisonment, starvation, and impending exile that God promises restoration. This is assurance. God will make good on the covenant God established to be the people, to be the God of these people, and to be faithful, and to bless them. Then the promise gets more specific. As the Lord promises, in those days and at that time, I will raise up a righteous branch from David's line, who will do what is just and right in the land. In the midst of a system that is plagued by corrupt leaders who abuse power and use people, God promises to provide a leader whose preoccupation will be with justice. This leader will use power to elevate the powerless. And finally, in verse 16, the Lord promises, in those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this is what he will be called. The Lord is our righteousness. So even as Jerusalem is the site of God's judgment, at the same time, God promises to make his people the place from which righteousness will flow out into the world. Another translation puts it this way: Jerusalem will live securely. And here is what it will be called: Yahweh is our righteousness. This title, Yahweh is our righteousness, was actually one bestowed on kings. In fact, Zedekiah's name means Yahweh is my righteousness. Of course, that is not how he behaved, and he failed to live up to his namesake. And so now, the community is being recognized as the site and the beacon that shines God's righteousness. It isn't through religious practices of priests or through the political efforts of kings that the community will be restored. It is only by dwelling in God that there is safety. It is by following the footsteps of a leader who is inclined toward justice that the people of God are able to act justly, as befits those who dwell in God's kingdom. And the community has the responsibility to recognize itself as that place from which God's righteousness can be experienced. The people of God are the site of God's safety in the world. So with these three verses that are located in the midst of despair, God promises that in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, there is hope for those who suffer. And justice will ultimately be realized because God will be faithful to the covenant God has made. These verses of hope are appearing in the midst of a narrative where the destruction of Jerusalem is about to take place. However, verses 14 through 26 of this chapter are actually a later addition to the book of Jeremiah. And they were probably added around the time of Ezra and Nehemiah in the 5th century, when the Jewish people already were living in exile in Babylon. A word of hope in the midst of those circumstances seems absurd. But that is what God gives. This generation of exiles clung to the hope that they found in Jeremiah 30 through 33. That section is known as the Book of Consolation, or the Book of Comfort. And they return again and again to this text for comfort and for hope in those years of exile. These words that we've read today, wherever they were heard, whether by Jeremiah and his contemporaries, by the exiles in Babylon, by later Jewish readers, or by us, have for so long been words of hope to people facing horrendous circumstances. In the midst of immense suffering, these words remind us, God has not abandoned God's people. It's obvious that our generation desperately needs hope. It's true that we're not safe. Our era is one of unbelievable violence, uncertainty, suffering. So we respond by locking our doors, paying for our militarization with tax dollars, talking about building walls to keep people out. But when we do this, we deceive ourselves. And Jeremiah helps us to see that safety is not an external that we go and find. No, safety is a way of being in the world by abiding in God. And as we abide in God and God in us, we become beacons of God's security and salvation in the world. Righteousness, right living, enacting justice, this is directly tied by the writer to security in this passage, as it is throughout the scriptures. This short passage from Jeremiah couldn't have come at a more appropriate time for us. I was struck by the fact that this was the lectionary reading for this weekend, since right now there are over 60 million war refugees in the world. 60 million war refugees. Over 10 million of those people are from Syria. And according to the United Nations, we are in the greatest refugee crisis in history since World War II. One of the greatest refugee crises this world has ever seen. Not perhaps so dissimilar from the Israelites waiting in Babylon, waiting in Jerusalem. These refugees are men, women, and children who are fleeing violence in their countries. And they are knocking on our doors, seeking a safer place to lay their heads at night. In light of these overwhelming statistics, a word of hope would seem absurd. But that's what God gives. Because, in fact, it's exactly what we need if we are going to reorient ourselves to love. Psychology has taught us that when we are afraid, our brains are incapable of behaving in loving ways. We go into fight or flight mode. And inevitably, the people around us get hurt as we lash out in self-defense. In the aftermath of the shocking attacks in Paris and Beirut, fear of the other has motivated words of hate and actions of exclusion. We've heard a lot of people in recent days aim tremendous vitriol at refugees. We desperately need hope at this moment to reorient the way that we think about the other. When so many people are using fear-mongering tactics to try to keep people out, we have the opportunity to welcome refugees and all who seek a safe place to dwell. Exclusion of the other is rooted in a fear that my identity is threatened by the presence of one who is different. But we don't need to fear anyone, because our identity is firmly rooted in the covenantal love of a faithful God. And as the beloved people of God, we are to welcome outsiders as members of God's family. As leaders and as critical lovers of the church, we have to consider whether our own communities are safe places to dwell. I invite you to consider with me a few examples. Think of the gay couple who grew up in a church, neither of whom has returned in 20 years because they were shunned as teenagers. Would they say that your church is a safe place to dwell? Think of the homeless woman who wanders in from time to time, halfway through the service, with all of her bags piled up in the pew. Would she say that your church is a safe place to dwell? Or what about those whose race, culture, ethnicity, language is different from most of the people in your congregation, would they say that your church is a safe place to dwell? Or to put it another way, would people be able to say of our communities, Yahweh is their righteousness? It's not surprising that we hold these kind of anxieties within ourselves as we look out on a very violent world. But God calls us to not live in fear, but in love. God fills us with hope in the midst of hopeless situations. When God seems furthest away in our world, that is precisely when God is doing something new. Our physical security is not guaranteed, of course. We need only recall that we live on the other side of the righteous branch being broken. Jesus wasn't safe from the horrors of this world, but he did not give in to fear. In love, he lived justly. And in love, he made the ultimate sacrifice. And because of him, we needn't fear death. We need not fear the other, because we no longer live with the fear that violence is somehow more powerful than love. The word of hope to which we must cling is that love is stronger than death. Recently, my church helped to resettle a Syrian refugee family. A mother, a father, their 2 young boys, and they have another baby on the way. And this was right in the aftermath of the attacks in Paris and Beirut and the outcry that followed from many folks about whether refugees should be let in at all. They were settled in an apartment in Azusa, and my community has concerned itself with providing everything that this family needs as they adjust to a life away from loved ones and from the life that they've known. I'm so hopeful that we'll continue to care for them and for others as they adjust to a new culture. And I hope that they will be able to dwell in safety here. The U.S. government is currently looking to resettle Syrian refugees in communities where there already are a number of Syrian folks and where there are lots of folks who speak Arabic. Either of those situations is the ideal. LA has over 16,000 Syrian-born residents, and nearly 2,000 of those live in Glendale, just down the street from us here. This means that our city will likely receive quite a few refugees in the months to come. And I hope that our churches will be able to respond and welcome. I hope that we will help these folks to dwell in safety. To speak a word of hope in a world that is so hell-bent on fear seems absurd, does it not? But that is the task that God has given us, having spoken a word of hope first to us. So, this is what we courageously and hopefully proclaim. Fuller Seminary will live securely. And here is what it will be called. Yahweh is our righteousness. Our churches will live securely. And here is what they will be called. Yahweh is our righteousness. The city of Los Angeles will live securely. And here is what it will be called. Yahweh is our righteousness. The United States of America will live securely. And here is what it will be called. Yahweh is our righteousness. Our world, God's world, will live securely. And here is what it will be called. Yahweh is our